So I want to first bring up our first panel, which is going to talk about a lot of different issues involving different modes and new developments. And I can't think of a better person, who's always ahead of his time and still is Buzz Paswell, the founder of our great center. I want to thank him for all his support over the years and for his mentorship. And he's going to be around forever. Yes. Yeah, he's on. Well, we're going to give him a message. Without further ado, our founder, our inspiration, Buzz Paswell, who's going to moderate our first session.
Thank you, Matt, for a nice warm introduction. My panel can take their chairs. Bill and Tracy and Kathy in that order. They'll speak in that order. I want to say a few words first. It echoes a little bit of what Matt said, and while we're here, and I think a number of you know that in the 80s, I was at Chicago Transit Authority. I was running the Chicago Transit Authority, and being an engineer, and I'd come from academia, I was already well versed in computers and computing, and I got to CTA in '86 and found out that they only had one mainframe and very little use of computers. And one of the first days I was there, I asked the person from capital programming, the person head of capital programming, to bring me the capital plan for the next few years. And he brought me yellow sheets that accountants used to use. You probably see them in Charles Dickens movies or something like that. And I said, why don't you do it on a computer? And he didn't have computers. And believe it or not, in order to get computing into CTA, I had to convince the board that it was cost effective. There were still then people saying, why do we need computers? Why don't we do it the old way? And that's sort of the momentum in society that takes place. And if we go ahead to the future, which is basically now, as a number of us talk to transit organizations, some of them are way ahead. They're using mobile ticketing and next train coming and on, and getting newer generation buses and everything. But others keep saying things like, well, we want to invest, but we want to wait for the new technology to be proven. And the thing I always have to say to them is these brilliant technologists, whether they're in California, most of them are in New York, even though Hollywood promotes Silicon Valley. They're in New York, and they're actually all over the country and all over the world. The world shares information. They're not waiting for transit to catch up. They keep inventing new things every day. And my lesson to transit, my caution to transit people, is you've got to jump in technology now, because it's not going to wait to invent something until you're ready to apply it. It's already applying it, and we see that happening a little bit around the region. We see the MTA thinking now of a new fare card, and the fear is by the time they have the new fare card, maybe the third generation of mobile ticketing will be taking place. So we'll have to look at that. The interesting thing about a conference like this is that it's happening at all. A number of you I've known for many years, a number of you are new students, and there's a real divide for those of us that did transportation. I'll call it 20th century transportation. It was all about building supply and the highway capacity manual and the manual of uniform traffic control device. And we used to have what we call demand models, which were really models to prove that you could do a benefit cost on supply and build supply. It was all about building roads. And now we come to the point where, as Matt mentioned, it's all about the fact that the user has more choices now, and the kinds of transportation systems that are being offered, whether it's bike sharing or ride sharing or walking, as many New Yorkers do, or car sharing or transit-oriented design. The whole new thinking is that with the amounts of data that are available, not only to somebody operating the system, but to the user of the system, and you'll hear people talk about that this morning, that the whole concept of how do we plan and use our transportation systems for the benefit of the users, to make their lives better, to enrich their lives. People are moving back to the cities because not everyone has moved back to the city yet, unfortunately. Not everybody lives, as we've learned, in New York and California. There are people living other places, but we'll have to convince them to move in the next 4 years to move to New York and California. But people are looking for new modes, and it doesn't mean that these new modes are better. Questions arise. If we go to autonomous vehicles, does that mean we still live with a car-oriented society? Does it mean that in the long run, the cars and dispersion go together? Profound questions that have to be answered by this new generation of planners who are using new tools, big data, new computing tools, new kinds of models, and forget that there's things like the highway capacity manual. They could probably click that off on the computer if they need to very quickly. So I think there's a real shift from how we do transportation planning and analysis that I used to like to say went to the year 2000. In 2000, the millennium really was a benchmark and a time for change, and the change was the big data, user orientation, and the rapid integration of new technologies, because the new technologies, as I said before, aren't going to wait. We have a terrific panel to talk about these things this morning. Their bios are their long bios are in your program, and I urge you to, one, read their bios, and two, when you see how interesting they are, at the breaks, come up and talk to them. Exchange cards, exchange ideas, and hear what they've got to say. They'll present in the order on the program. The first will be Bill Long. I first met Bill when he was running Clever Devices, which was already providing innovative high-tech solutions for transit systems. He is now the head of Mobility Minds, which is doing very interesting data and data sharing to improve transportation use. Tracy Lamb, who's with SGS Heart Aviation, works in human systems, and she's also an aviator, but is talking about something we don't hear that much about, but we know it's critical to our economy, is the whole field of aviation, and where is that going? And Kathy Lawson and Gennady Kosoy. Kathy will talk from the University of Albany. Kathy is also a data analyst, a computer whiz, and is going to talk about that old mode, the ferry, but innovations in ferry with the ability to integrate new technology into old modes and make them work well. So why don't we start with Bill Long.
To change this, next slide. Okay, very good. Good morning. I'd like to thank Matt Doss for introducing the topic of sustainability, because transportation is key. And I wanted to start my presentation this morning talking about social justice and how transportation relates to social justice. And Wikipedia defines social justice as the fair and just relation between the individual and society. And what I believe is transportation is the keystone of social justice. And as such, we collectively serve a higher purpose by enhancing mobility at large. Well, transportation is key to realizing a just society, and just as this, and as such, your work in this field serves a higher purpose. And to the students in the audience here, I'd like to say congratulations on your choice to work in this important field, and good luck in the future. I'm Bill Long, and I would like to talk to you today about what's next in transportation technology, and work with an organization called Mobility Mind. And it's a new way that transit connects to riders by way of the Internet of Things. Just by a show of hands, I would imagine everybody here is familiar with the concept of the Internet of Things, right? Okay. Well, you may have already been thinking that this is not new, right? Internet of Things is a very well-defined architecture, and what is new is the way we envision using these very same attributes to realize increased efficiencies in the way that transportation is used. Our goal is to enable multimodal travel and to make public transportation more accessible and more efficient. We help connect riders to transit by way of the Internet of Things. And I've been working with technology related to public transportation for some time now. I started working with transit with Buzz, back in the 1980s, and back then it was a pretty simple affair. There really wasn't much technology, but there was an appetite with some leading agencies to derive some significant benefits, and one of those was to collect data. And we weren't really quite sure how we were going to use it at the time, but we knew that it was important. So I started a company called Clever Devices. It's an interesting story in the basement of a bar that I owned, and I was really looking to go legit at the time. So had this concept that would go in and work in the technology field, and I did this because a high school classmate of mine, Sal Lanuto, a brilliant guy, and he was working in technology, and he came into the bar one night and started to talk about the future of technology and the internet and personal computers and all of these things, and it was so good he sold me right on the minute. And the next day I woke up and said, hey, I'm in the technology business, but I really didn't know much about it. So after a couple dozen trips to the New York Public Library, I started to learn a little bit about the promise that technology held. And our first work was with digital audio. And the technology was in its infancy at the time, so anybody could get into the field, and I was proof of that. So started to make these voice enunciation systems. And one of the earliest projects was for the New York City Transit Authority. And the Americans with Disability Act required that they put wheelchair lifts on buses, and unfortunately, they hadn't foreseen all of the problems with the wheelchair lifts, and they were driving down Fifth Avenue with the lift extended, and people were maimed. So they needed a voice enunciation system to make safety announcements for passengers not to ride in the rear door wheel, be cautious of the, and people who've been riding New York City Transit for a while certainly have heard those messages. Well, we did the same type of work for the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission, making announcements under Giuliani's administration. We also developed automated voice enunciation systems to make transit accessible for the blind. And we did fleet management systems, bus countdown systems, automatic vehicle monitoring, and all of these things really drove value when it came to technology and public transportation. And we learned about transit, and we learned how to make transit better with technology. And we built out these systems, but they were pretty complicated, and we didn't have the tools that are around today. So this process was very expensive, and it was very risky. Well, today, we see the change in the marketplace, both in the sensors and processing that's available in transit, the creation of this data, and also with technology that we all walk around with in our pockets right now. How many people here have mobile phones, right? It's a very common technology. Well, that's more processing power, more memory. They're smarter, they're cheaper than computers were, when we first started years ago. Well, several years ago, I sold my interest in Clever Devices, but I stayed interested in the market. And lately, I've come to see the value to be had by realigning the way we use transportation, where we use technology to improve public transportation. I believe that we can transform the way riders think and act by their choices using the same technologies that exist in a different way. There have been some significant changes in the technical landscape over the past few years. Computers are generally smaller, smarter, faster, cheaper. This is true of both the computers in transit and the ones in your pocket. I wonder, mobile phones and transit technology are both very powerful. These technologies have been on a collision course for some time now, and it's the combination of the two that present us with the opportunity to look at mobility from a different perspective. Now, our earliest work in Chicago with bus countdown systems turned out to be wildly successful, and it was successful because prior to that, you had to put a display in the bus shelters, and that was a very expensive process, and the information on bus arrival times was only available inside the shelter. So our first work was to put that information on the web, and you could look at it on a website, and some entrepreneurial thinkers in Chicago started to put displays in their coffee shops or in their store or what have you, so people could look at the displays and know when available bus service was approaching. But what really drove this home and made it mainstream is when the PDA or the mobile phone became so prominent. And then with the mobile phone now, you can look for bus times, you can look at arrival times, you could plan routes, all from this device. Well, those things were great. They were standalone, but we just think that there's a lot more potential when you start to expand the use of this combination and look at it from a different way. Agencies presently own and operate their own end-to-end fare payment systems. There's a better way. Mobility Mine, right? Okay, what we believe is that the future is in the cloud. And it's a cloud called Mobility Mine. And what we do is we make data readily available and bring it to a form and a place that is most useful, a cloud called Mobility Mine. This creates the interface between riders and public transportation and multimodal transportation. Okay, there's the cloud, that's Mobility Mine. Mobility Mine is a systematic approach to establish the data interface between transit, riders, and the providers of relevant goods and services. We do this by creating a structured, cloud-based interface. This is obvious, but it doesn't exist. What we're talking about now is creating a cloud called Mobility Mine, and within Mobility Mine is the data that's necessary for third-party providers to be able to provide the goods and services that the public, the riding public, need in order to be able to access and pay for public transportation. Now, it's very different, and it's a radical departure from what happens right now. I can remember one time being in a guy by the name of Jeff Johnson, who was running the operation for a bus and LAC MTA, and Jeff called me into his office, and he said, "Hey, how do you like this conference table?" I said, "I like the conference table, Jeff. He was my customer. Of course I was going to like his table." He goes, how about the desk? How do you like the desk?" I go, "Jeff, it's a lovely desk. I like your desk." He goes, "Well, what do you notice about this furniture?" And I said, "It's beautiful, Jeff. I don't know what to tell you." Well, what Jeff went on to tell me is that what was unique about this furniture is that it was manufactured in the carpenter shop on the first floor of his office. And it was incredulous to me. Why would union people be building conference tables and desks? And I asked Jeff that question. And what he told me is they don't have anything to do. And we've had it's a tradition here at the LAC MTA. We've had a carpenter shop since the streetcars were made out of wood. And that's how transit lets go. They really don't. Transit also has experience. Wasn't too long ago here in New York that they printed their own currency. It was called a token. And when that token went out of favor, right, it was because MetroCard. And when you introduce MetroCard, it revolutionized transportation in the United States. And it revolutionized transportation because when you can link trips, more people rode transit. Transit had been in a constant state of decline since the end of the Second World War. And the introduction of, and that was for the whole country, the introduction of MetroCard was enough to increase ridership that reversed that trend. And over a couple, 3-4 year program, Buzz, I would imagine something like that, it eclipsed the all-time highs. So it was that introduction of that technology that wound up holding the problem, just in New York, for the entire country. Well, we believe Mobility Mind holds that same type of potential right now. So we're presented with the opportunity, the way people interact with transit and transit with people, right? Well, the way we do that is not by going back to the carpenter shop and trying to build some more furniture, right? The way we do that is to allow the free market forces to come in and participate in the provision of mobility services. And the way we do that is by developing a systematic approach, this standardized data architecture, and putting that data inside the cloud, and dealing with third-party suppliers. Now, when you look, there are a lot of third-party suppliers that are already providing information to riders. Google, Apple, all of these organizations are eager to capture the mainstream market and provide relevant information on transit, but they've yet to approach the world of fair payment. And what we look to do is to take this cloud and connect the world at large through the cloud and the Transit Authority, and have the Transit Authority focus on what they do and what they do incredibly well, which is provide transportation service safely, efficiently, and, Matt, again, to your point, sustainably, right? There's no better way from the environment and also from a social justice perspective. It's a critical component to this, and by connecting the public at large through a standardized interface, what we're allowing is third-party suppliers to come in and transact with riders. And the advantages in doing this are economic. The cost structures to do this are much lower. And these people that we see on your bottom right there are entities that compete. They compete naturally. And when they compete on price, they compete on service, and they compete on bundling, right? So when you look at what service could an organization provide to a rider, we're talking about things like information. We're talking about things like deals on multimodal travel. So what are my multimodal choices? What is my ability to pay for these multimodal choices? Where do the discounts lie, and why? So that competitive environment is something that can exist by regulation from the Transit Authority right now. But the Transit Authority providing a standard rack rate for transportation services can use third parties to conduct these transactions, and the benefits of that are far-reaching. And some of the benefits right now, and anybody that works in transit knows that it's a customer service business. So in order to serve the customer, it takes people, it takes cost, it's overhead, it's labor. So all of those requirements would be fulfilled by the third-party suppliers. So this concept is, this product is really a different way to think about transit, and a different way to realize the benefit of technology. All right, and essentially we're looking to do this with a mobile phone, and mobile phone reacts to the entry point on a transit system, whether that be a bus or a rail, and the transactions again are by third-party providers through this structured cloud-based interface, and then they submit payment to the Transit Authority. Well, when you consider the potential, herein, it's not just transit, because it's all of these multimodal opportunities that we're talking about. A lot of people talk about automated guided vehicles, but not too many people are talking about how do you pay for that, and how do you link a multimodal trip, and is the requirement going to be on you, the rider, to say that I'm going to pay for each one of these transactions individually? Well, I think those icons in the lower right-hand corner would have a different view of how they want to approach you and your mobility needs, and how they want to fulfill them. And it's some people are going to want to travel based solely on cost. They're economically bound to travel the cheapest way. Well, others are going to look at this from a speed perspective. I've got to get there. People's mindsets change when it rains or when it's cold. So every day is a different, has the potential to be a different experience, and the flexibility that's inherent in using independent third-party providers allows people to relate to their mobility choices based on their own thought processes for that day. I think I did it. Okay, so in closing, Mobility Mind is the data and the interface to third-party providers. Third-party providers use data to provide apps that show available choices in the context that of their own individual value propositions. Riders choose on their preference, and there's a great deal of room for innovation. And one of the things I want to talk about, just to mention the fact that what we're doing is we're inviting free thinking into the marketplace. This architecture allows transit to transact in a way that they're absolutely bound to do to collect the money for providing the service, but it also allows these third-party providers to be able to drive innovation through their own ideas. And I know there's students in here, I know there's people walking down Fifth Avenue right now that have ideas about how they can make their transit or their mobility choices more interesting or more affordable or safer. And there's just to get those ideas embodied in a transit-based single-payer fare system is much more difficult than if we allow the world at large to connect to transit via the Internet of Things. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions for Bill, if there are any.
Yeah, so basically your model, you're basically going to get rid of all the transit tokens for the city, because people can pay by their phones. They can pay not only to New York City Transit, they can pay New Jersey Transit, Amtrak, that kind of internet-based connectivity. People can get around different areas. You're going to get rid of a lot of the workforce.
First of all, we have to be very sensitive to labor, right, and their needs and the tradition of what they've been able to do to make transit work all of these years. And I don't seek to eliminate jobs. Two things: that this is still work that has to be done, and that work should be done by union employees, by my view. And second of all, I think a lot of that, just as the bottom right-hand corner showed that there are multiple third-party providers, that there can be multiple third-party providers to provide those same goods and services. So it really is just an extension of the need to privatize, those services. So I don't see eliminating it at all. I think there's still a similar need to what exists now.
Could you just talk a little bit about how far along you are on the quest to getting this done, and what you consider to be the greatest barrier to success?
First of all, we're at the point we're developing the code for the cloud. That's where we are right now. The biggest impediment is I shouldn't say this. Back when I ran my bar, I had an accountant. His name was Bernie Steinhoff, and he had a saying. He said, "Their minds are so narrow, their ears touch." And I think that's the impediment. I think people have to open their mind and their way of thinking to a new way and let go, right? It's going to be very difficult to get people to let go the furniture shop, so to speak.
We're going to have questions. We want to get all three people up here to give presentations. You'll find a mix of ideas. But the one thing this suggests very strongly is that institutions have to change dramatically. And a quick example that I like to give is if you want to take the train for some reason from Trenton to Hempstead, you should be able to, on your smartphone, just get a ticket from Trenton to Hempstead. The banks will worry about how many miles you go on the Long Island Railroad or New Jersey Transit, or maybe New Jersey Transit and the MTA will have a new service that provides trips when they look at all this. The nature of trip making will change, just as when you introduced MetroCard, within 3 months, there were 1 million more transit trips per day. Now, some of them would have been transfers, 1 million more transit trips a day on the New York City Transit than there were before the introduction of MetroCard. And when you keep making access to mobility easier, people travel more. You make it easier, people travel more, and it creates more opportunities. So the answer here is maybe you won't have the same job, but you're going to be creating new opportunities. Just as when high-tech rail cars and high-tech buses started being the only buses and rail cars you could buy in the 80s, it meant that maintenance of these cars are going to have to change dramatically. But the labor unions were trained to operate on whole new things. And as ridership goes up, you need now more maintainers. So the fact that you have more technology doesn't mean that jobs necessarily have to decrease, but it takes planning.